DFBOX are real-time interaction tools for game designers and developers on the Unity development platform without code. This set of tools is designed to create interactive interactions in the scene. Working with animation, sound, and building logic between components will be easier and faster. The set is suitable for both beginners and professionals. If necessary, you can expand the functionality and add new features. There are 3 basic components in the DFBOX: DF Trigger, DF Checker and DF Worker. These basic components are used to build game logic and how the player or NPC interacts with the game world. The DFBOX also contains components for playing animations, playing sounds, managing physical interactions with objects, and so on. What and how the events are used for. Using events, you can call public methods of objects, both standard components and components created by the user. Game object, the game object containing a component to call methods. Component, the component for which public methods will be called, with the DF attribute method for call attribute. Method, the called method. Parameter 0, the first parameter of the called method. Parameter 1, the second parameter of the called method. If the toggle for this event is off, all elements of this event will not be called in game mode. Used for debugging in the editor. If the toggle for this element in this event is off, only that element of that event will not be called in game mode. These buttons are for adding and removing elements of this event. When you press the right mouse button on the event element, a context menu will appear, with the help of which you can clone, delete, copy and paste the selected elements of this event. You can call methods from your components. For this you must place the DF attribute method for call attribute before your public method declaration. The type of method's returned value is not important. Limitations: your method must be public. Your method may have 1 or 2 parameters, or does not have any. If your method has 1 parameter, parameter must be one of the types: bool, int, float, string, color, vector 2, vector 3, vector 4 or transform. If your method has 2 parameters, first parameter must be int string, second parameter must be one of the types: bool, int, float, string, color, vector 2, vector 3, vector 4 or transform. Let's create a simple scene to explore the components. The scene now contains the floor, door model, and DFFPS controller to move around the scene. The DFFPS controller component is a temporary component created to showcase this asset and will be removed or changed in future releases. Now we will add a DF animation component to the door model and select an animation clip. The DF animation component is used to play an animation clip and control its properties, such as speed, direction of playback, and so on. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description, if toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Animation clip for using in this component. Animation speed, current animation speed. Wrap mode, once, loop, ping pong. Once, when time reaches the end of the animation clip, the clip will automatically stop playing and time will be reset to beginning of the clip. Loop, when time reaches the end of the animation clip, time will continue at the beginning. Ping pong, when time reaches the end of the animation clip, time will ping pong back between beginning and end. Is play on awake, play this animation clip when enter in game mode or when game has started. Play forward, play this animation clip from start to end. Play backward, play this animation clip from end to start. Play invert, play this animation clip invert, depends on which position animation is, start or end. Stop playing of this animation clip. Set begin, setting the starting position in this animation clip. Set end, setting the end position in this animation clip. Is use events, if toggle is on, show and use events, on reach begin and on reach end. On reach begin, events called when time reaches the start of the animation clip. On reach end, events called when time reaches the end of the animation clip. For use in events, called methods. Play forward. Play the current animation clip from begin to end. Play backward. Play the current animation clip from end to begin. Play invert. Play this animation clip from start to end or vice versa, depends on where the animation is, start or end. Pause. Pause the current animation clip. Stop. Stop the current animation clip. Set speed. Setting the speed of the current animation clip. Animation enable, bool is enable. Enable or disable the DF animation component of the current game object, is enable is true, will be enabled and vice versa. Animation enable invert. Enable or disable the animation component of the current game object, was enabled, disable and vice versa. The DF trigger component is used to control trigger events when a game object enters, stands, or exits the trigger collider, trigger type, enter. Or when a player looks at a trigger, trigger type, look, using the DFFPS trigger activator component, which we will look at later. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description, if toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Trigger type, the trigger can be of two types, enter or look, which we will look at later. Is use action key, if toggle is on, the on-stay event will only be called when the button is pressed. This button is used to display the DF Manager input window where you can add, remove or edit its elements. The DF Manager input window we will look at later. Collider, the collider for tracking collisions of game objects in this trigger. Disable after exit, if toggle is on, disable DF trigger, when the object exits the collider. Is use tag, if toggle is on, collision tracking will only be performed for game objects with this tag. Is show gizmo, if toggle is on, show collider gizmo. Is stay once, if toggle is on, the event on stay, will be called only once. Consider the types of the triggers. Trigger type, enter, monitors when a game object enters, stands, or exits the trigger collider, and calls the appropriate events. On enter, the event will be called when the game object enters the trigger collider. On stay, the event will be called when the game object is in the trigger collider. On exit, the event will be called when the game object exits the trigger collider. Trigger type, look, monitors when the player looks at the trigger using the DFFPS trigger activator component and calls the on-look event when the use button is clicked, which is assigned in the DFFPS trigger activator component. On look, the event will be called when the player looks at a trigger using a component DFFPS trigger activator. For use in events, called methods. Trigger enable, bool is enable or disable the DF trigger component of the current game object, is enable is true, will be enabled and vice versa. Trigger enable invert, enable or disable the DF trigger component of the current game object, was enabled, disable and vice versa. Let's consider an example of using triggers in a scene. For this we add it to the door and configure it so that when the player enters the trigger, the door opens, and when the player exits the trigger, the door closes. To do this, in the trigger from the onEnter event, we will call the play forward method of the DF animation component, which will play the animation from start to end, and from the onExit event, we will call play backward method of the DF animation component, which will play the animation from end to start. Let's check. Everything works. The DF audio player component is used to store and play sound clips. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description, if toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Audio source. Audio source for playing sound clips. Button add layer. Add sound layer, array of sound clips. Name layer. Name of this sound layer. Button add clip. Add audio clip in this sound layer. Button delete. Delete sound clip from this sound layer. Object field for audio clip. Button play. Play this audio clip. Volume. The volume of this audio clip during playback. For use in events, called methods. Play a random, index layer. Play a random sound of the DF audio player component. Index layer is the index of the sound layer from which the sound will be played. Play, index layer, index audio clip. Play a sound of the DF audio player component. Index audio clip is the index of the audio clip that will be played. Stop. Stop playing any sound of the DF audio player component of the current game object. Let's take a look at an example of using DF audio player in a scene. To do this, we will add the DF audio player component to the door and configure it so that when the player enters the trigger, the sound of the door opening is played, and when the player exits the trigger, the sound of the door closing is played. In the trigger in the onEnter and onExit events, we will call the play method of the DF audio player component and select the audio clips to play. Let's check it out. The DFChecker component is used to check conditions. If all the elements in the condition are true, then the event of this condition is executed. The checked condition elements can be of the following types: game object, component, or global variables, bool, int, float, string. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description. If toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Add condition button. Add another condition for the DFChecker component. Add element button. Add condition element, game object, component or global variable of type bool, int, float, or string. Delete button. Delete the current condition. Add and delete buttons. Clone or remove the current condition element. Game object. Game object to be checked. Method. Method for checking the current element of a condition. Component. Component to be checked. Variable. Global variable to be checked. Parameter. Parameter to be checked. Event. The event of this condition will be called when all the elements of this condition are true. For use in events, called methods. Check conditions. Checking conditions of the DFChecker component of the current game object. If the condition is true, then execute the events. Let's take a look at an example of using DFChecker in a scene. For example, we can only play animations for opening and closing a door if the player has a key to the door. To do this, we need a global Boolean variable indicating whether the player has a key to the door and a DFChecker component to check the state of this variable. Global variables can be created, edited or deleted in the DF Manager Global Variables window. The DF Manager Global Variables is used to store, manage and use global variables such as bool, int, float, string, available in any scene of the current project. The DF Manager Global Variables window can be called by clicking the menu item, Tools, DFBOX, Managers, Manager Global Variables. Let's consider it in more detail. Button Add. Add new, bool, int, float, string, variable. Button Delete. Delete this, bool, int, float, string, variable. Text field, the name of this, bool, int, float, string, variable. Parameter, bool, int, float, or string. The parameter of this, bool, int, float, string, variable. Let's create a global Boolean variable in the DF Manager Global Variables window, name it if player has key, and set it to false. Now, let's add two child game objects to the door, named checkEnter and checkExit, and add a DFChecker component to each of them. In the game object named checkEnter, we will add a condition in which we add the global bool element and assign the isGlobalBool equal check method to check the value of the global Boolean variable if player has key. If all the elements in this condition are true, at the moment we have one element, then we will play the animation of opening the door. For this, in the game object named checkEnter, we call the playForward method of the DF animation component. Let's do the same with the checkExit game object. In the onEnter trigger event, we will call the checkConditions method of the DFChecker component of the game object named checkEnter, and in the onExit trigger event, we will call the checkConditions method of the DFChecker component of the game object named checkExit. Let's check. We can see that the door animations are not playing because the player does not have a key. Warning: DFFPS Trigger Activator component is a temporary component created to showcase this asset and will be removed or changed in the future releases. DFFPS Trigger Activator is used to manage dynamic objects and triggers. Trigger type is look. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description. If toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Is use images. If toggle is on, changing pointing images when this component looks at a trigger of type look. Image default. The displayed image when this component does not point at the trigger of type look. Image active. The displayed image when this component points at the trigger of type look. Collision distance. The distance within which the collision check is performed with the look type trigger. Button use. The input button to use a dynamic object. Button drop. The input button to place a dynamic object. Clicking on this button will display the DF Manager input window. Throw force. The force with which the dynamic object will be thrown by pressing the drop button is show ray. If toggle is on, show pointing ray. Ray length is equal to collision distance value. To enable the player to take the key, we will add a DFFPS trigger activator component to the camera component, which is a child of DFFPS controller. We will also add the DF trigger component to the key model. The trigger type is look. When the player takes the key, we must disable the key game object and set the global Boolean variable if player has key to true. To do this, in the onLook event of the DF trigger component, we will call the game object enable method, with which we disable the game object of the key, and also call the set global bool method, with which we will set the value of the global Boolean variable if player has key to the value true. Let's check. Everything works. The DF dynamic object component is used to control a dynamic object, take, put, throw, using the DFFPS trigger activator component. The rigid body, collider, DF trigger components must be attached to this game object. Trigger type must be look. The onLook event of this trigger must contain the attach to trigger activator method. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description. If toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Hold distance. Dynamic object hold distance. For use in events, called methods. Attach to trigger activator. Attaching this game object to DF trigger activator, the player will hold this game object. Let's add the box model to the scene. The player will be able to take and move this box using the DFFPS trigger activator component, which we used earlier. To do this, we need to add the DF dynamic object component to the box model, which will interact with the DFFPS trigger activator component. In the onLook event of the DF trigger component, we will call the attach to trigger activator method of the DF dynamic object component. Also in the DF dynamic object component, we can set the distance at which the box will be held. In the DFFPS trigger activator component, we will set two images, image default. The DFFPS trigger activator component does not intersect with the trigger of the DF dynamic object component, image active. There is an intersection of the DFFPS trigger activator component with the trigger of the DF dynamic object component. Also in the DFFPS trigger activator component we will set the collision distance within which it will be possible to take the box and user input buttons for picking and throwing this box. We can add, edit and delete user input buttons in the DF Manager input window, which can be called from a menu item or by clicking on this button. The DF Manager input is used to store, manage and use user input keys, keyboard type, available in any scene of the current project. The DF Manager input window can be called by clicking the menu item, Tools, DFBOX, Managers, Manager input. Let's consider it in more detail. Add key, add new input element. Delete button. Delete current input element. Text field. The name of the current input element. Button to select the current input element by pressing the button. Button for selecting the current input element in the standard way. Let's check. We take the box, for this we press the button use. We can either put this box by clicking the drop button or throw it away by clicking the left mouse button. The DF worker is used to perform any actions, with or without delay, called from other events or controlled by the user, or for a specified time or number of repetitions. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description. If toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Work type. Default, input, time, count. Default. Events can only be called from other events. Input. Events can only be called when the button is pressed. Time. Events can only be called after the delay has expired and only during the specified time. Count. Events can only be called after the delay has expired and only during the specified countdown. Input button. Button for call events. Work type, input. Delay, in seconds. Delay before calling events, work type. Time or count. During time, in seconds. During this time value, events will be called, work type. Time. During count. During this value event will be called, work type. Count. Event. Events called when the current condition is done. For use in events, called methods. Work start. Activating the DF worker component of the current game object. Work stop. Deactivating the DF worker component of the current game object. DF spawner is used to create a game object in the scene with random or transform coordinates. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description, if toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Object for spawn. Game object, to be created in the scene. Is random range. If toggle is on, game object will be created with random coordinates, otherwise with transform coordinates. Is random range, vector 3. Game object will be created with random coordinates in the given range, relative to the bounding box. Is show gizmo. Show bounding box gizmo. For use in events, called methods. Spawn. Creating a given game object in the scene. Spawn and destroy, float delay. Creation of the given game object in the scene, this object will be destroyed after a delay. Let's look at an example of using the DF worker and DF spawner components. To do this, in the DF spawner component, we will assign a cube game object to create it on the scene with random coordinates in a given range. In the DF worker component, we will select the work type as time, set the delay value as 1 second, the value of the time during which this component will work, set as 5 seconds. In the event of this component, call the spawn method of the DF spawner component. Let's start the game mode. Everything works.